Okay, we start. Last week we proved the chessboard estimate, and today I would like to give you one non-trivial application of this technique. And the application is to the anisotropic XY model, so it's 10.3 application. The anisotropic XY model. Okay, so let me first define this model. So it's a version of the XY model, so the configuration space is the same. Let me call it omega, as usual. So it's the circle. The spins take value in the circle for each vertex in the two-dimensional torus. I will only consider the two-dimensional case, but the proof I will give works in any dimension larger or equal to 2, T to L. Then the spins Si, the spin at I will denote it Si1, Si2. So these are the two components of the spin. That's for all I in the torus. And then the Hamiltonian is defined as follows. So HL minus beta, sum over all edges in the torus, say Ij in, let me call it EL2, so EL2, I don't know if I already introduced this notation last week, but it's the set of all pairs of vertices in the torus which are neighbors. Okay. So it's minus beta, sum over all nearest neighbor vertices of, and this is where there is a difference with the usual XY model. So we get Si1 Sj1 plus alpha Si2 Sj2, where alpha is a number, say, between 0 and 1. Say 0 and 1. Called the anisotropy parameter. Anisotropy parameter. Let me explain a bit what this is about. So the Hamiltonian, if I put alpha equal to 1, let me say it here. If I put alpha equal to 1, here we just recover the scalar product of Si and Sj. So when alpha equals to 1, this reduces to the XY model. The usual reduces to the XY model. Okay, because this is just the scalar product. In general, when alpha is different from 1, this breaks the O2 symmetry that the XY model enjoys. So the XY model, the case alpha equals 1, is the only one with a Hamiltonian which is invariant under the action of a continuous symmetry group with O2 invariance. Okay. So in the case alpha equal 1, we already know that in dimension 2, and I'm only considering dimension 2 at the moment, so we already know that in dimension 2, by the Mermin-Wagner theorem, there is no Lagrange order. So Mermin-Wagner implies that in this case there is no Lagrange order in the system. Okay. So what we are interested in is what is the effect of slightly changing we are considering a slight deformation of the scalar product, which makes the first components interact strongly than the second component. Okay. But still, otherwise, the spins are continuous, and the model is very similar to the usual XY model. And the result you get is the following one. So let me say here, let's be precise, so no orientational Lagrange order. That's what we use as terminology. So the main theorem I want to prove today is theorem 10.11. It's telling you the following. So for any value of the anisotropy parameter which is strictly smaller than 1. So I really want the two components to interact differently, right? So I want alpha to be smaller than 1, otherwise we already know what happens when alpha is equal to 1. For any epsilon positive, you can find some temperature beta 0, which depends on alpha and epsilon, such that for any beta larger than beta 0, we have the following. So I will give two claims. The first one is that there is Lagrange order. So if I compute the expected value of Si1, Sj1, I'm looking, so again, it's L, beta, alpha. That's the Gibbs measure at inverse temperature beta with an anisotropy parameter alpha on the torus of size L. Right? So if I look at the projection along the first coordinate of the spin at j and the spin at I, this, if I take the infimum over all ij in the torus, this is bounded away from 0. So this is actually as close to 1 as I want. It's larger than 1 minus epsilon. Okay? And that's uniformly in the size of the torus. Okay? So that's the first claim. So this shows that as soon as alpha is different from 1, as soon as alpha is smaller than 1, you have Lagrange order. Orientational Lagrange order. Lagrange order. Okay. This can be rewritten slightly differently. I mean, there is an immediate consequence. Let me write it like that. So in particular, you have that the limit as L goes to infinity, so I'm taking the thermodynamic limit, letting my torus becoming infinitely large, and I compute the expected value of, say, m1 L square beta alpha. So what is this quantity? It's just the average. I average over the whole torus the first component of the spins, and I take the absolute value square. So where m1 L is the sum, it's the average, right? So it's 1 over the size of the torus. Then the sum over all I in the torus, Si1. Okay, it's the average first component over the torus, and take absolute value square, and this is larger than 1 minus epsilon. Again, for all beta larger than beta 0. Okay. So that's what I want to prove today. So let me start with a few remarks. First remark is that the result that I'm stating here in dimension 2 and for the XY model, it extends immediately. The proof is identical for any dimension which is larger or equal to 2. So it works also in higher dimensions. So maybe I will just write remarks. The proof extends immediately to the case D greater or equal to 2, and to anisotropic, not only XY model, but anisotropic ON model with n greater or equal to 2. Anisotropic ON models with n greater or equal to 2, which have Hamiltonian. Let me just write it. So these ones have Hamiltonian minus beta, sum over all ij in the d-dimensional edges in the d-dimensional torus, and then you get the first component Si1 Sj1 plus alpha, and then the sum over, say, k from 2 to d to n S I k S j k. Right? So you favor the first component, and all the other ones interact in a weaker way than the first component. So for this version of the anisotropic ON model, everything I'm saying here remains true and the proof is identical. Okay, also in higher dimension. So that's the first remark I wanted to make. I think there were a couple of others. Yes, one thing which is important is, as you see here, I'm only proving orientation along range order in two different statements, but each time it's just a statement of orientation along range order. I'm not proving here that you have two different infinite volume Gibbs states, one with magnetization along the first coordinate axis, which is positive, and one which is negative. So this I do not prove because it's harder to deduce it from this, but it can be deduced. It is possible. It's possible. Essentially by abstract nonsense. To extract the existence at large beta of two different Gibbs states. We say the expectation of S0, 1, which is in the infinite volume limit, so in this different Gibbs state, which is strictly larger or strictly smaller than 1, okay, depending on which of the two I take. So it's possible to deduce that from these statements, but I will not do it here because it requires some abstract theory which we have not seen this semester, so I cannot do it, but it's possible to do. And the last thing I wanted just to point out is that when we were looking, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, I don't remember, when we were proving the Mermin-Wagner theorem, we insisted a lot on the fact that we had a continuous symmetry group, and that the Mermin-Wagner theorem, the absence of long-range order, was a consequence of this continuous symmetry group, but it was not completely clear that this was really necessary because the basic argument was that we could construct these spin waves. So we were really using the fact that the spins could deform very slowly. So I can flip to distant spins slowly by rotating continuously my spins. And this does not require a priori a continuous symmetry, it just requires continuous spins. Okay, so it's an interesting question to know whether continuous symmetry is required or not. And this shows you that continuous symmetry is really required because here you do have continuous spins, but nevertheless, as soon as you break the continuous symmetry, for any alpha smaller than 1, you get a long-range order. So Mermin-Wagner theorem becomes wrong, right? So that was just a comment. And let's move to the proof. Okay, let me first show that the second statement here, this one follows from this one immediately. So, and for this, you just have to write n1 L square. This is 1 over T2L square, sum over I, J in T2L, Si1, Sj1, right? It's I've just taken the definition of N1L, take the square of this. Okay, maybe like that. And now we know that these quantities, they are large by the first claim, by this first claim. This is larger than 1 minus epsilon, if the first claim holds. If the first claim is true. That's uniformly in I and J, right? So the second claim follows immediately. The second claim follows from the first one. Right? This cancels with that, and you only get 1 minus epsilon, which remains. Okay, so what I have to prove really is the first claim, so this form of long-range order. Let's prove. So first remark, we are on a torus. And the Hamiltonian, obviously, the way it's written here, it's translation invariant. So so it's enough for me to control not these 2-point function for arbitrary I and j, but it's enough if I do it for I equal to 0. So translation invariance implies that it's enough to prove this claim, to prove it for I equals 0. Okay? And that's what I will do. So I want to consider the expected value of S01, Sj1 for an arbitrary j. We want to prove that infimum over j in the torus of S0, 1, Sj1. This is larger than 1 minus epsilon for any beta larger than beta 0 of epsilon and alpha. Okay. That's what we want to prove. So why is the result of the theorem somewhat plausible, at least? Let's look at the ground states, the model, so the configuration with minimal energy. What are the ground states? So if you look at the Hamiltonian, which is not there anymore, let me just write it. Okay, it's here in the case where k is equal to, there is only 2. Okay. So the point is that if you want to minimize the energy, there is a minus here. So you want to align the spins, and then you want to make the product of the spins as large as possible here so that the Hamiltonian becomes as small as possible. So of course you want to align them along the first coordinate, because otherwise here it will give you 1, but if you align in another direction it will give you only alpha, and alpha is smaller than 1. So if you want to minimize the energy, not only you want to align the spin, but you want to align them along their first component. So there are 2 ground states, which are the configurations with Si equal to 1, 0 for all I, or Si equal to minus 1, 0 for all I. Okay, these are the two ground states. They are all aligned in this direction or all aligned in this direction. Right? And there are no other ground states. So what one might hope is that when the temperature is very low, when beta is very large, the typical configuration that we see under this measure are small deformation of these ground states. So they will have most of the spins pointing horizontally and pointing toward one of all toward the right or all toward the left. Right? So plausible that at low temperature, typical configurations are small deformation of these configurations, and that's exactly what we are going to prove. Right? Most of the spin will be roughly aligned with the first direction, either most of them pointing rightward or most of them pointing leftward. Okay. So that's for the comment, and note that if I take alpha equal 1, so no anisotropy, this is already not true. So the ground states are degenerate. You have a continuum of ground states with the spins perfectly aligned, but in any possible direction, not only in these 2 directions. Right, so the situation is very different when alpha is equal to 1. Okay, so now we would like to prove something which is very similar to the Peierls argument. So when we were in the Ising model, looking at the low temperature Ising model with no magnetic field, we wanted to prove something similar, which was that at low temperature, basically everybody was plus or everybody was minus with only small deformation. Okay, and we use the Peierls argument to do that. Here it's a priori much harder because you have continuous spins, so there is no, You cannot draw very sharp contours, a priori, you cannot draw very sharp contours between nice values of the spin and bad values of the spin because you can go continuously from one to the other. So it's not completely clear how we should do that. And one natural way to proceed is to first discretize the model. So that's what we are going to do. So for any I in the torus, let's introduce the following indicator functions. So I will denote by, so let's fix. Okay, let me start. So fix delta between 0 and 1. And now for any I in the torus, let me define I plus delta I. This is the indicator that the spin at I has a first component which is larger than delta. So it's a spin which takes what you expect to be a good value. It has a large first component and large first component which points to the right. Now I want the complement, the symmetric event. So I minus delta, which will be the indicator that the spin at I has a large first component but pointing toward the left. So it's smaller or equal minus delta. And then you have the remainder. Values which you expect to be atypical, I will denote them by smaller than delta. This is just the indicator that the first component of the spin at I in absolute value is smaller than delta. Okay? So what we expect, if what I said here is true, what we expect is that for, if you fix delta and then you take beta large enough, what you expect is that most of the spins have I plus delta equal 1, or most of the spins have I minus delta equal 1. Okay? And this should always be very rare. So let's see how we can use that. So first thing we can do, so as I said, we are interested in this quantity, so S01, Sj1. Let me just write L as an index. Beta and alpha are fixed in the proof. I will not change them, so I omit them from the notation. And this is equal to S01, Sj1 multiplied by I0, plus delta plus I0 minus delta plus I0 smaller than delta times Ij plus delta plus Ij minus delta plus Ij smaller than delta. And then you get the expected value. That's obvious because this is equal to 1 and this is equal to 1. Okay, but I've just inserted 1. Not done anything. And now I expand the product. So what I get, let me maybe do it here. So we get several types of terms. Let's see. One thing which should be a good term is when you have I0 plus delta, Ij plus delta. That means that both have large first component and both point in the same direction. So that's something that you expect to be typical. So S01, Sj1, then I plus delta 0, I plus delta j. And then there is a second term of the same type is when I take I minus delta at 0 and at j, which means that they both have a large first component but pointing toward the left. So this should also be good. I0 minus delta, Ij minus delta. So that's the first term that we expect to be the main contribution. And then we get also, yes, should be enough place. So S01, Sj1, which multiplies. Now what do we want to take? So I can take, say, some mixture like, okay, I will first take this. So I have I0 smaller than delta, Ij smaller than delta, then I will have I plus delta 0, I j say smaller than delta, plus I 0 minus delta I j smaller than delta, plus I 0 smaller than delta I j plus delta, plus I 0 smaller than delta I j minus delta. Let's put all these guys together. They're essentially the same. And then the only one which is remaining is S0, 1, Sj1. So I have 4, 5, 6, 7. There are only two which remains, and which are when I take a plus delta and minus delta plus delta. So I 0 plus delta ij minus delta plus I 0 minus delta ij plus delta. Okay. I've just expanded the product, and now you see from what is here that I've regrouped terms. I've regrouped terms because all the terms I've regrouped give me exactly the same contribution. So if you look at these two terms, obviously the Hamiltonian of the model does not, the energy of configuration does not change if I take all the spins in the box and I change their first component, the sign of the first component. I reflect the sign of all the first components of the spins. This does not change anything because in the Hamiltonian you get Si1, Sj1. If you change the sign of both, this does not change, it's quadratic. Okay? So and this is also quadratic. So this term and this term will give you exactly the same contribution. So I can get rid of this guy and put a 2 here. Right? Now here it's completely similar. All these guys, when you have one plus and one smaller, it's also completely clear by the symmetry of the model that they all give you the same contribution. Right? Plus and smaller and minus and smaller are the same because I can just reflect the first component. And when I interchange 0 and j, it's the same because of the symmetries. Because 0 and j plays exactly the same role as j and 0 in the Hamiltonian. So all these guys I can forget and put a 4 here. They give me exactly the same contribution. And then finally, we get, for this term, again, by symmetry, it's just flipping the first component. So this disappears and I get a 2. Okay. So it's already a bit simpler. And now, what can we say? So what can we say about this product when this is true? So certainly we can say that this guy here, when both the spin at 0 have a first component larger than delta and at j its first component is larger than delta, then the product of first component is larger than delta squared. Okay. Certainly that's true. Here, let's see. So here the words that can happen, I mean, they could point in different directions here. So this could, I mean, the sign could be bad. So you could get at worst something like minus delta square, if I'm not mistaken. I'll check my computation before going on afterward. Here you get 1 plus and 1 smaller, so the sign could not match. So at worst, this is minus, so it will be delta times 1. So this could be minus delta. And this one at worst, so I have 1 plus and 1 minus, so they point in wrong direction. So at worst, it's minus 1. Okay? I think it's correct. Let me just write what we get. Just check that I have written something wrong. Oh, I think it's correct. So let's see. So we get that S01, Sj1, this is larger or equal. So we said 2 delta squared times the expectation of this product. plus delta 0 I minus plus delta j. Okay, that's the first term. Then we get correction, so minus delta square, which multiplies the expectation of I 0 smaller than delta ij smaller than delta, minus 4 delta, which multiplies I plus delta at 0 and I smaller than delta at j. Thank you, yes, here there is a square, right? Should be a square. Then this one is like that, and the last one is a minus 2, I0 plus delta, ij minus delta. Okay, that's where we are for the moment. So we expect, we'll see what we can say about this guy in a minute, but what do we expect? So we expect that this guy should be, this expectation should be small because it's unlikely for any spin to have a first component which is small when beta is large, because it's better energetically to have a large first component. Okay? So we expect that this is small because this should be small because both terms are small. In particular, should be enough to keep just one of them. So let me say that this is certainly smaller than I0 smaller than delta L. For this guy, this is typical, so that's what I expect to be always, I mean, this is something of order 1, this should be very small, right? So this again makes sense to only keep the part which should be small. Okay, so I'll do it like that. And of course, okay, it's at j, but by translation invariance, this I could write I smaller than delta 0. Okay, the expected value will be the same by translation invariance. And then for this guy, you expect it to be small because it should be unlikely to have one spin which has a large first component here and one spin which has a large first component going in the other direction here, because that means that in between somewhere I have to take values which have a small first component, or then I have two spins which have both large components which are nearest neighbor and point in opposite direction, which both things cost a lot. So this should be easy to bound. So the only thing I'm still not very happy with is this guy. I would like to have it a bit more explicit, and then maybe I do it on the next board. And then we'll get the final form of the estimate we want to make, to prove. So let me just look at this guy. So I0 plus delta ij plus delta. So we expect it to be something typical. This we expect it to be mostly 1. So this we want, or 1/2. So this we want to write slightly differently. So I will keep this guy, I0 plus delta, but this guy I write minus ij minus delta minus ij smaller than delta. Right, I plus delta plus ij minus delta plus ij smaller than delta, this is equal to 1. So this is certainly an identity. Then I expand this. This tells me that this is the expected value of I0 plus delta plus, maybe I'll do it on 3 lines. The expected value of, oh, there is a minus, the value of I0 plus delta ij minus delta, and then a minus I0 plus delta ij smaller than delta. Okay. Then we do the same kind of estimates as here. So this guy, it's pointless to keep both. So this is smaller than, for the same reason as before, as this. Okay. First do it at j and then use translation invariance to bring it to 0. The same thing. So we are already at, so this is larger than I0 plus delta L, plus this guy is okay, it's of the same form as this guy, so this is not a problem. I0 plus delta ij minus delta. And this last, sorry, with a minus, and the last guy is just the I0 smaller than delta L. And then this guy, I'm almost happy. I'm not completely happy yet, so let me still do one thing. This guy, I want to write it as follows. So this is okay, the expectation of, so I0 plus delta, I can write it as 1/2 I0 plus delta plus I0 minus delta. Right, because the expected value of I0 plus delta is the same as the expected value of I0 minus delta, because the model is invariant under flipping the first component of the spins. Okay, so that these two events should have the same probability. And then that's nice because this is equal to, so the 1/2 I take out, and this guy here, it's 1 minus I0 smaller than delta. Okay. So this gives you indeed, as we expected, that this first term here, which is typical, should be basically 1/2 plus something small. So indeed, we extract the 1/2 now, happy. And then the something small will be all the remaining terms. So I have minus 1/2 expected value of I0 smaller than delta L. Right. So now I'm injecting these estimates here, and we get the final thing I want. So this is larger or equal, I'll do it here, 1/2. Okay, it's 1/2 times 2 delta square, so it's delta square. Remember that delta, I choose delta, so I can choose delta as close to 1 as I want in the proof. So think of this as being basically 1. It's 1 minus something as small as I want. Okay, so that's the main term I want. And then the rest are error terms, which I will have to control. So there are two types of error terms. One is an error term of the form, a multiple of the expected value of I0 smaller than delta. I0 smaller than delta. And what is the prefactor? So let's see. So I get, from this guy, I get 2 delta square. And what do I get? I get here a minus 1, but I also get a minus 1/2. So I get a minus 3/2. Minus 3/2 times 2 delta square, it's minus 3 delta square. But I also get an additional, where is it? These two guys, here and there. So I get another delta square from here. So it's minus 4 delta square, and I get minus 4 delta. So this, I can put 4 delta in front of everything. 4 delta times delta plus 1. 4 delta 1 plus delta. Check my computation, because on the blackboard it's easy to make mistakes. And then, although this prefactor won't matter very much, but, and the other term is I0 plus delta ij minus delta, this type of terms. And how many do I get? So I get minus 1 from here, so it's minus 2 delta square. And then I still get a minus 2. So it's minus 2 times 1 plus delta square. I have not made a mistake. Times this. Okay, so that's our estimate. So what we want to lower bound, we want to show that this is as close to 1 as we want when beta is large. This we know that it's larger than delta square, which is as close as we want to 1. We just choose it. Minus 2 error terms, which we expect to be small because we expect most of the spins to have large first components, so this should be unlikely. And we don't expect to have large positive and large negative first component which coexist too often, because this would entail a large energetic penalty when these guys meet. Okay? So we expect that these two terms are small. So if I can show that for any delta, you fix delta as small as close to 1 as you want, and I can show that if I choose beta large enough, this is as small as I want and this is as small as I want, I'm done. Okay? And that's what we are going to do now. So there are two lemmas which treat both of these terms. Maybe I can first erase here. And the proof of these two lemmas relies on the chessboard estimate. So the first one is lemma 1014. So the conclusion conclusion follows from these two lemmas. So lemma 1014 tells you the following. So for any alpha strictly smaller than 1, any delta between 0 and 1, any epsilon positive, there exists beta 0 of alpha, delta, epsilon such that for any beta larger than beta naught, the expected value, let me write it precisely here, this guy is smaller than epsilon. That's the first statement. And then the second lemma is 1015. For any 0, alpha, 1, 0, delta, 1, epsilon positive, there exists beta 0, which is beta 0. Turns out that it depends only on alpha and epsilon, such that it doesn't matter that it's true. So for beta larger than beta 0, we have that the product I0 plus delta, I0 minus delta. This is smaller than epsilon. Okay. It's clear that from these two lemmas, the theorem is proved, right? Because, as I said, you fix delta as close to 1 as you want, 1 minus something very small, and then this two lemma proves that this guy and this guy can be made as small as you want by taking beta large. Okay. So all this thing is as close to 1 as I want, provided that beta is large. Okay. So these are the two main things we have to prove. Let's start. Proof of lemma 1014. Proving these claims without reflection positivity, without the chessboard estimate, it's not so easy. So, there are ways, but it's not easy, especially if you want to be able to do it for alpha arbitrarily close to 1. It's a bit tricky, but with reflection positivity, you will see that it's very, very simple. So let's start. We want to control this event. So the expected value of I0 smaller than delta and beta alpha. So I said that I don't write beta and alpha. I'll just do that. Then what do we have? So we have a function which has a support which is reduced to just the vertex at the origin. Okay, just 1 point function. So it's a lambda b local function for lambda b, which is just the origin. Okay. So I can use the chessboard estimate. So in the picture here should be the following. So you have the torus, two-dimensional torus. You have your function here, I0 smaller than delta. And if I want to apply the chessboard estimate, I need to have a function for each cell. So I will make reflection of functions in each of these cells. So what function am I going to put in the other cell, but just the function 1, the constant 1. If I put the constant 1 everywhere, I can just insert 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1 here. Okay, it doesn't change anything. So I'm putting just 1s everywhere, just the constants. Then I can apply the chessboard estimate. Chessboard estimate, what does it tell you? It tells you that you get the product over all the functions which appear in the left-hand side. So you take the product of all these functions of the expected value of what you get if you reflect the function you have chosen everywhere on the torus. So I get for all these guys, except for the one at the bottom left here, all these other guys, they are just giving me 1s. So the expectation value of putting 1 everywhere is just 1. So this doesn't give me anything. The only guy which gives me something non-trivial is when I take this guy and I reflect it everywhere. What I get is the same condition because the reflection of this guy is itself. So I0 plus delta is just that I of this vertex is plus delta, I of this vertex plus delta, and so on. So this will be smaller than the expected value of the product over all all vertices of the lattice, 12, of I smaller than delta. Right? Then don't forget that when we apply the chessboard estimate, we get 1 over the size of the torus. So I get this to the power 1 over T2. Okay. And all other products that I get here are just equal to 1. So that's the only thing that remains. So that's the chessboard estimate in our case. So what have I done? I started from this, which is a local. I'm computing the probability of some local event. It's complicated because it's just some local events. I don't know exactly, I don't control very well this probability measure. It's very hard for me to tell you what happens at 0. I've transformed this into something which is a global event. I'm saying that this bad thing happening at 0, I've replaced it by something which is bad happening everywhere. I'm asking for all the spins in the box to have a small first component. This should be very, very bad, right? So this should be much, much simpler to estimate than this guy. So the philosophy is that this is microscopic, and this is hard, while this is macroscopic, and so it should be easy, or easier. Okay, that's the philosophy. So you replace something local, which is hard, by something global, which would be much simpler to control. And indeed, you will see that it's much simpler to control. So let me just introduce a notation for this, so that I don't have to write it too many times. So this event here is product of, like that, I will write it I smaller than delta L. It's just a definition, notation. So it's already past tense, so we make the break now, and I will show you how you control this macroscopic event after the break. So we start at 15. Okay, we'll resume. So now I want to show you how we can upper bound easily this term. So we want to upper bound the expectation of this event I, L smaller than delta, that all the spins have a first component which is smaller than delta in absolute value, all the spin on the lattice. So this I can write as a ratio of two partition functions, one which is restricted to configuration which satisfy this event, and the other one which is just the usual partition function. So I can write it as what I will write ZL smaller than delta over ZL. And what are these two guys? So ZL smaller than delta is just the expected value of E minus the Hamiltonian times the indicator that the event is true under the measure which we call mu naught, which is just the product measure. So where mu naught is the product over I in the torus of this measure rho, and here rho is the uniform measure on the circle, which I assume for convenience to be normalized. Okay. So uniform measure on the circle, normalized. That doesn't change anything because the normalization is both in the numerator and denominator, so in any case would cancel, but it's just convenient to assume that. And the partition function, the denominator, is just E minus HL, the usual one, mu naught. Right? Certainly, this expectation is this over that. Right? So now what do I need to do? So I'm after an upper bound on this expectation, so I want an upper bound on the numerator and a lower bound on the denominator. So let's start with an upper bound on the numerator. Upper bound on Z L smaller than delta. And the point is, okay, here I'm only taking the expected value over configuration for which this is non-zero, otherwise I just get a contribution which is 0. So I can assume that the configuration I'm interested in satisfies when this equal to 1. So I, L smaller than delta, omega equal 1. So assume this is true. Then this implies that, so for any omega such that this is true, we have the following bound on the Hamiltonian. So HL of omega is equal to what? It's equal to, by definition, minus beta, sum over all, okay, ij is uv, j is something special, so uv in in these edges of the torus, dimensional torus, of this SU1 SV1 plus alpha SU2 SV2. Okay. And now I'm looking for, I want to minimize, to find the lower bound on, so you see, I want an upper bound on Z. So an upper bound on Z means that I need a lower bound on H. So I want a lower bound on H which is uniform over all omega for which this event is true. You see, when this event is true, I'm forcing all the first components of my spin to be small. And this should have a large energetical penalty. It should cost a lot of energy to have all the first component which is small. So I should be able to extract a nice lower bound on this Hamiltonian. And then what you observe is that this guy, ideally, if I wanted to minimize the Hamiltonian, I would like to make this equal to 1 to align perfectly the two spins in the first direction, but I cannot do this because of the constraint that the first component is at most delta. So that means that I get at most delta square plus alpha 1 minus delta square. Right? The first component, you make it as large as you want, as you can, which is delta, and then the second component has to be equal to square root of 1 minus delta square. Right? Total length of the vector is 1. Okay, and then you take the product of two values like that, you get this. Okay? So you get, for the Hamiltonian, you get a lower bound, which is minus, so this does not depend on U and V. So how many edges do you have on the torus? You have the number of edges of the torus is twice the number of vertices of the torus, so you get minus 2 beta times this quantity, delta square plus alpha 1 minus delta square, times the size of the torus. Okay. I'm just using that. The number of edges there is twice the number of vertices. That's all. So this implies that this partition function, ZL smaller than delta, this is smaller than, so this E minus H, I bounded by that, so it gives me a E2 beta delta square plus alpha 1 minus delta square T12, right? Then this does not depend on the spins, on the configuration, so I can take it out of the expectation. Then I get expectation of some event. This is a probability smaller than 1, so I can just forget it. And I get this bound. So this gives me the upper bound I want on the numerator. So let's look at the denominator now. So lower bound on ZL. Do something a bit similar. So let's see, so we want, so ZL, it's equal to the expected value of E minus HL under mu naught. And this I will rewrite as follows. So intuitively, what do we want to do? So we want to show that this is unlikely. And why should it be unlikely when beta is large? It's because when beta is large, your first component of the spins would like to be larger than delta. So here we are using this bound is good if delta is smaller than the typical value that the first component would like to take, right? But to show that that indeed I'm losing something here, I have to compare with the lower bound where I'm using the fact that I can align my spin with the first component which is bigger than delta. I have to use that. So what I will do is that I will fix some delta tilde in 0, 1, which will be bigger than delta. I will choose it later, but it will be bigger than delta, and I will force my spins to align along the first component with first component which is at least delta. So I will denote by I plus delta tilde L. This will be the event that will be the product over all I in the torus, T12, I plus delta tilde of I. So I'm forcing all the guys to point to the right with the first component which is at least equal to delta tilde. Right? With delta tilde, which will be larger than delta. And I want to show that when beta is large, this will be much better than what I got here. So let's do it here. So I will write this. This will be larger than, let's do it like that. This will be larger than E minus H L times this indicator, I plus delta tilde L. Mu naught. Right, I'm just adding an indicator, so I'm just reducing the expected value. And then this I want to write as follows. So I want to write this E minus H L I L plus delta tilde mu naught divided by the expected value of I L plus delta tilde mu naught times the expected value of I L plus delta tilde mu naught. There are many ways of making the estimate. This one gives you a nice estimate. I'm doing it this way. So now, doing it this way, I can interpret this first term, as the expected value of E minus H under a new probability measure, where I forced the spins. So the original probability measure was the product of the rows, which were the uniform measure on the circle. Now, because of this constraint, I get the uniform probability measure on an arc of the circle, which is the arc which corresponds to the first component larger than delta tilde. Right? So this is equal, just the L is larger than, and then this is E minus HL under something which I will call mu 0 tilde, and then I get this IL plus delta tilde mu 0, where mu 0 tilde is just something, just the expected value of this something times the indicator, mu 0 over IL plus delta tilde mu 0, just probability measure. Okay. So now I have to lower bound these two quantities separately. Let's start with this one. So E minus HL under mu 0 tilde, well, by Jensen inequality, this is certainly larger than E minus the expected value of HL. Okay. Now, what is the expected value of HL under mu 0 tilde? That's minus beta, sum overall, say UV, of SU1 SV1 plus alpha SU2 SV2. And then I have to take the expected value. So this is expected value under mu 0 tilde, expected value under mu 0 tilde. Now, notice that mu 0 tilde, so mu 0 was a product measure. The constraint I'm putting here is a product. Also, it's a product of all spins. Where is it? It's a product of all spins of the fact that the first component of the spin is larger than delta tilde. So it's also a product measure. So in particular, these guys and these guys, they are independent random variables under mu 0 tilde. So this is equal to SU1 mu 0 tilde, SV1 mu 0 tilde, and these guys are equal to SU2 mu 0 tilde, SV2 mu 0 tilde. Just a product measure. But it's what is the product measure here? So it's the product of this measure. So I have here the circle, that's S1. Somewhere I have this delta tilde, and it's the uniform measure on this arc that I'm considering. It's the product of these measures that I'm looking at. When you take this times the product measure, it's this. So uniform measure on this arc. So that means that this is symmetric if I change the second component of the spin. Right? It's symmetric if I reflect things through the x-axis. So these guys are 0 by symmetry. This is 0, nothing to do. And what can I say about these guys? Well, these guys, they are all at least equal to delta tilde. Each of them is at least equal to delta tilde. So this is larger than delta tilde. This is larger than delta tilde. So what I conclude is that all this, the Hamiltonian, expected value of the Hamiltonian is smaller than minus, again, the number of edges here, it's twice the number of vertices of the lattice, of the torus. So it's 2 beta delta tilde square times the size of the torus. Okay, that's for this term. So it immediately gives me the bound I want here. So I get E minus HL mu 0 tilde. This is larger than E2 beta delta tilde square T2L. Right? So now I still have to lower bound this second factor, but it's not a big deal. Yes, this I can erase. The second factor is actually much simpler to lower bound because you just compute it, so it's I0 plus, IL plus delta tilde under this measure mu 0 tilde. This you compute explicitly. It's the product over all vertices in the box, T12, of the probability that the first component is larger than delta tilde. So this is just a trigonometry now. If I want, I can compute this constant. Right? I don't care about the value of this constant, so I don't compute it. I just use the fact that this I can write as E minus C of delta tilde for some value C of delta tilde. So the whole thing here is E minus C delta tilde times the size of the torus. Okay? You can compute this C if you want, but it will play no role in what we want to do. So I won't do it. So now I get a lower bound on ZL, which is E, say, exponential minus 2 beta, something, and then the size of the torus. And what is this something? So I get, from the first factor here, I get delta tilde square. And from the second factor, I get a minus the size, oh, sorry, I want a plus here, right? So minus C of delta tilde over 2 beta, if I'm not mistaken. The point which is important here is that this guy has no beta, but this guy has a beta. When beta is large, this guy will play no role, so I can make it as small as I want by taking beta large, right? So this guy is the important one. Okay, so now with everything together, so I have my lower bound on ZL, I have my upper bound on ZL smaller than delta. So this implies, and the conclusion will follow immediately from all this, that what I called IL smaller than delta, this quantity, which was ZL smaller than delta over ZL, this is smaller than exponential minus 2 beta sub mes, and then the size of the torus, T2L. Okay, I don't know if you can read, but it's nothing, it's just the size of the torus, which is here, okay, 12. And let's see what is the mes, which is here. So in the upper bound, which we have here, well, let me start with the lower bound. So this was the lower bound on ZL, but ZL is in the denominator, so when I write it like that, it gets a minus, so I get delta tilde square. There will be this trivial correction C of delta tilde over 2 beta, something like that. And then you get the contribution from the upper bound, which is here, so it's a delta square minus alpha times 1 minus delta square. So let me write it like that. Alpha times 1 minus delta square. That's the bound we get. Just the upper bound on this, lower bound on that, you put them together, you get this estimate. And now I have to choose delta tilde. And I could optimize over delta tilde, but why should I optimize? I will just choose something which makes the computation simple. So I want to take delta tilde, of course, larger than that. I would like all this to be positive so that this decays. Right? I want a small upper bound. So I want this to be larger than that, but I want it to be smaller than 1, so we'll just take the average between this and 1. Okay? That's a natural choice. So I choose delta tilde, which is equal to 1 plus delta square plus alpha 1 minus delta square over 2, just a choice. And then if you make the computation, this gives you, so there will be 1/2 And then this delta square over 2, it remains here. It will be minus delta square plus alpha 1 minus delta square over 2. Okay, I should put everything together. So it's 1 minus delta square. All this over 2. But then you see that I can take the 1 minus delta square out. So it's 1 minus delta square, which multiplies 1 minus alpha. Or 1 plus 1 should be 1 minus alpha if I made things correctly. So let me, yes, of course, there is a minus 1. 1 minus alpha, and over 2. So that's what we get. You just substitute for delta tilde, it's delta tilde square. For delta tilde square, you substitute this quantity, and this gives you this expression. And then what do you do? So this is equal, by our choice of delta, to E minus, so let me take out the 2, it will be beta, which multiplies 1 minus delta square, 1 minus alpha, right? Probably the sign should not help me here, so probably there is a minus sign. I have to fight against this guy. It cannot help me. I took out a factor of 1.5, so there is no 1/2 remaining. You'll check the computation, and then the size of the torus. T12. Okay, so that's the expression you get. And now you choose beta large. If I choose beta large, so for any delta smaller than 1 and any alpha smaller than 1, this quantity is strictly positive, this product here. So this is strictly positive. Now if I take beta large, this I can make it so small that all this quantity is larger than 1 minus delta square, 1 minus alpha over 2. For all beta larger than beta 0. Right? Just take beta large so that this is so small that it remains at least 1/2 of this. Right? And then you're done. For this guy, this is exponential of minus some constant, which depends on delta and alpha, which you can make as good as you want if you choose delta and alpha sufficiently close to 1 and take beta large in the end. So all this gives you something which decays like E minus C of beta, say, times the size of the torus. Right? That's the kind of bound you get. And then this is exactly what you need for the lemma. Lemma is concluded because if you remember the first inequality we wrote in the proof of this lemma, it was the chessboard estimate, the application of the chessboard estimate tells you that the quantity you were interested in, which was the expectation value of I0 smaller than delta, this was smaller than IL, smaller than delta L to the power 1 over the size of the torus, right? So now you just use this inequality here, and you get that this is E minus C beta. The size of the torus simplified, get E minus C beta, and that's exactly what you wanted because you can make the constant as large as you want. Okay? This is just a constant independent of beta, and then you have a beta in front. You can make it as large as you want. Okay, so this concludes the proof of the first lemma. It was pretty simple because it was something which only depended on one vertex, and then you use chessboard estimate to make a macroscopic event out of it. The proof of the second lemma must be a bit more intricate because it's both of the spins so for the second lemma we want to have I plus delta, I0 plus delta, ij minus delta. So both the indicators are likely events. What is unlikely is to have both of them together because they point in different directions. And so you need to do something which would be similar to the Payens argument because you have coexistence of two different values which are both typical, but the coexistence should be atypical. So proof of lemma 1015. So we'll use a Payens argument, a version of Payens argument should be the third one you see this semester, with the one we saw for the Ising model and the one you saw for the Potts model in Hugo's course. So let's see how to implement it here. So the first thing you want to do is what is important is that these guys, they point in opposite direction. The fact that they take a large first component is irrelevant. So I want to introduce now I plus I. This will just be the indicator that SI1 is larger or equal to 0, and I minus will be the indicator that SI1 is smaller than 0, and then I will just bound trivially these things which we are interested in, so I plus delta, there is I minus delta, this quantity, I will just bound it by something which is rougher, which is just I plus, ij minus. I don't care that the components are large. I want the first component to point in different direction. In any case, they will be large because for an energetical reason, they want to be large in principle. And if they are not large, that means that they are small, but we already know that small ones are unlikely. So that's a natural thing to do. And let's see how we can make a bias argument from that. So now each spin on the lattice, it will satisfy either this, it will have this indicator equal to 1 or this indicator equal to 1. A priori, because I have a greater or equal and smaller equal, they could both be equal to 1, but this happens with 0 probability because they need to have their first component which is exactly equal to 0, which is 0 under the a priori measure, okay? Which has 0 probability under the a priori measure. So you see that what I've done in this, with this kind of indicator, I get in my configuration, I get either I can associate a plus or a minus to each vertex of the lattice, depending on whether the first component of the corresponding spin is positive or negative. Right? So that's what I want to implement now. So one way to do it is the following one. So note that I plus I minus is equal to 1 almost surely. Okay. So you can write, actually, in any case, it's larger or equal to 1, which would be also enough, but it's 1 almost surely. And then you write I plus ij minus, can write it as follows. So it will be I plus ij minus, and then product over all V in the torus, say different from INJ, for example. It was 0 in J. I should be consistent in my notation, so different from 0 in J, okay, of I plus V plus I minus V, expected value. Okay, I have just introduced something which is equal to 1 almost sure. This is equal to 1 almost sure. Okay, and then you expand the product. So when you expand the product, for each vertex here, you get either a plus if you take this term or a minus if you take this term. Okay, I will index the summands in mind, the sum I get once I expand the product, by a plus at the vertex V if I've taken this term, and minus at the vertex V if I've taken this term. So this gives me a sum over eta, which are collection of plus or minus 1, at each vertex of the torus, okay, and such that, well, at 0 I have a plus, and at j I have a minus, so such that eta 0 is equal to 1, and eta j is equal to minus 1. Okay, and then what do I get? I get the expected value of the product over all V in the lattice, T12, of I, V, eta V. Right? At the vertex V, I put the value plus or minus 1 according to which term I'm considering. Right? If I've chosen the plus term or the minus term. Good. Now, this is just a configuration of the Ising model on the torus. Right? just plus or minus 1 at each vertex. Now, if I know that I have a 1 at 0 and a minus 1 at j, then I know that I can look at the contours of the Ising model, and there must be a contour separating 0 and j, exactly what we did for the pulse argument in the two-dimensional case, on Z2. Right? So we know that this should be smaller than sum over all gamma. Let me write it like that, and this sum is over contours separating. I will say what I mean by separating in a second, separating 0 and j. Okay. Sum over gamma, sum over configuration eta, which such that the contour of eta contains the contour gamma, and then this expectation, product over V in T2 L I V eta V. Right? So what do I mean by separating? Let me maybe make the picture here. So on the torus, something like that. And we have 0 and j. And I claim that there are 3 types of contours to consider, actually really 2. One possibility is that I just have a contour surrounding 0. Okay, that's a possibility. But I can also have instead a contour surrounding j. That's the second possibility. Okay. And the third possibility, which we didn't have on Z2, was that I have a contour winding around the torus. Something like that. Maybe more than once, but okay. These are the 3 possibilities for contours separating 0 and j. Okay? Of course, if I have one, then I must have another one, but this doesn't matter. So what, the sum over gamma here is over either these guys or guys like that. Okay. Good. So now it's starting to look pretty good. It's just that this is not in a form which I like very much. So let me try to work it out a bit better. So let me introduce. So for any gamma separating 0 and j, let gamma orthogonal be the set of all pairs of neighbors UV in EL2 such that, which are crossing gamma. Right? What I mean is, this is gamma, and I want all these pairs of, and so on and so forth. Right? All these guys. That's a gamma orthogonal, this set of all edges which cross the contour gamma. Okay, and so that's what I want to denote this way, and then I will use the convention that I will always write U for the plus side. Okay, this contour gamma on one side has pluses and the other side has minuses. Okay, so I will use U for the one which is on the plus side and V for the one which is on the minus side. Okay, just a convention which will make things a bit simpler. So let's see what I can do with this thing. So maybe let me erase that. It's clear what is this gamma orthogonal, I hope. Okay. Just pairs of neighbors which are on each side of gamma. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to rewrite the product overall UV, which belongs to gamma orthogonal, UV in gamma orthogonal, of I U plus I V minus. I want to get an expression for this quantity. So I'm choosing a contour gamma and I'm forcing all the spins on one side of the contour to be pluses and all spins on the other side of the contour to be minuses. I want to take the probability of this, and I want to rewrite it slightly differently. So this is certainly equal to the product over the same thing, uv in gamma orthogonal, I plus u, I minus v, times the product over all I in the torus, okay, of I plus I minus I. Okay, just introducing 1 again, exactly as before. This is 1, I'm just inserting 1. Okay, and then I expand as before. If I do that, what do I get? So when I expand, I will get configurations. Again, I will get configuration of the Ising model, which must have all the spins on one side of gamma orthogonal taking the value plus, and all the spins on the other side of gamma orthogonal taking the value minus. Right? So this should be essentially the probability, I don't know how I've written it, but it's the probability that you have, basically probability that you have gamma. It's the sum. Okay, there is a subtlety that I will mention in a second. So this is sum overall, configuration eta in plus or minus 1 to the power t to L, such that among the contours of eta, there is the contour gamma orthogonal, the contour gamma. Okay, and then I get the expected value of product over, say, I in t to L, I eta. All right? When I expand this, along gamma orthogonal, I already know the values. It's plus on one side and minus on the other side. And then I get the rest of the configuration by expanding this. So I get an expression like that. Why is it an inequality and not an identity? It's because of this deformation rule we used when we define contours. So that means that even if you force, so if you take a contour gamma, stupid, but if you take a contour gamma like that and you say, okay, I have pluses everywhere here and minuses everywhere here, okay, you still, so if I take a configuration which satisfies that, it's not clear that it has the contour gamma. Because what could happen is that I put a minus here, then I get something like that, and because of our deformation rule, this destroys the contour gamma, it creates a new contour. It's not the contour gamma anymore, it's another contour. Right? So this gives you a lower bound, but it doesn't matter very much. That's all we need in any case. We could also just get rid of this deformation rule, but since we used it in the Ising model, let's keep it. So we get this lower bound. Now we recognize here, it's exactly what we had there. This term here, it's exactly the same as this term here. There's zero difference. It's exactly the same, except that I used v instead of I. It's the same expression. So that means that I get an upper bound there by replacing it by this. So this is smaller than the expression which is up there, which is the product, the expected value of the product over uv in gamma orthogonal. Okay, I should put the expected value. Product over uv in gamma orthogonal, I plus u, I minus v. Right? That's what we have proved. So we have that the quantity we want to bound, it's smaller than the sum over all contours separating 0 and j of the expected value of the product over pairs of neighbors which live on each side of the contour gamma, I plus u, I minus v. Right? So now comes the lemma. It's lemma, where is it? Or claim, it's not a lemma, it's a claim. Claim, there exists a constant which depends only on alpha, which is positive, such that this expected value, which is there, this expected value of the product over uv in gamma orthogonal, I plus u, I minus v, this guy, this is smaller than E minus C beta gamma. Okay. I claim that this is true. let's assume it's true, and we'll prove it afterwards. Let's assume that this is true. And let's check that then the conclusion is essentially immediate. Okay. So what do we get? We get that the quantity we wanted to bound from the start, which was this I0 plus delta ij minus delta, we have seen that this is smaller than the sum over all gamma which separates 0 and j, separating 0 and j, of, well, this quantity, but which is bounded by this quantity. So it's E minus C beta gamma. So we get exactly the same kind of bound we got when doing the Peierls argument. Okay, we have a C, but it doesn't change anything. So we have the same bound we had when doing the Peierls argument. So we can just conclude exactly as we did on the Peierls argument, showing that when beta is large, this sum is as small as I want. Right? That's what we did when doing the Peierls argument. Now, the only thing that I have to explain is how you deal with this contour which are winding around the torus, because this we didn't have in Z2. We had these kind of guys. We know that contribution of these guys and these guys, it's bounded by something as small as I want. I still have to just take care of these big guys. Okay. So as on Z2, except for contours winding around the torus, we just have to bound their contribution. So for those we have sum over gamma winding around the torus of E minus C beta gamma. This I work exactly as we did. So this is it. Okay, this is smaller, say, than sum over the length, which is at least equal to L. It has better have a length at least L if it has to wind around the torus, right? L to infinity. Okay, it's an upper bound. And then I want to have E minus C beta L. And then the number of gamma winding around the torus with gamma equal to L. Right? And now how do you bound this guy? Well, it's very simple. If it's winding around the torus, let me again draw a small torus here. If it's winding around the torus, it has to intersect, say, let's be very rough. You choose two big circles, this one, and this one, right? It has to intersect one of these guys, right? Otherwise it cannot wind around the torus. So this has length 2L, so I can choose the starting point of my path along this one of these two lines. So this gives me a 2L. This is smaller than 2L times E minus times 4, say, to the power L, for example. Very rough bound. So that's, if you know the starting, so that's the starting point. So once you know the starting point, for each step you have 4 possibilities. So this gives you an upper bound of the number of guys which are winding around the torus. Okay? And then when you sum over this gives you something which is smaller than E minus C prime L. Okay, so this is something which is completely negligible. C prime beta L, actually. So when beta is large, this is not only smaller than epsilon, it's actually going to 0 even when you take the thermodynamic limit. So for any beta. Okay, so the proof is over once we have proved this claim. So the only thing left is to prove the claim. And that's where we use reflection positivity. I've not used it yet in this lab. So it's a slightly more sophisticated use of the reflection positivity, but only slightly. So let me think how, okay, I will do it this way. So I want to split the edges which appear in this product into 4 families. Okay. So I want to write gamma orthogonal as gamma orthogonal HE union gamma orthogonal HO union gamma orthogonal VE union gamma orthogonal VO. So what are these sets? So there are disjoint sets of disjoint subsets of this of gamma orthogonal, which are defined as follows. So H is for horizontal, V for vertical, Okay, so that's easy. So these are the horizontal edges and the horizontal pairs of neighbors in gamma orthogonal. These are the vertical ones. That's easy. Now, what are the E and the O? So E is what you get when, so H and E is what you get when the minimum of E, let's say, if I take an edge, if you take an edge UV, okay, which belongs to gamma H E, then it is horizontal, and E is so I want the minimum of the first component, U1, D1, to be even. Okay. And O, if I take an edge, and O, if it's minimum of U1, V1 is odd. And then on this side you do the same. So E will be when the minimum of U2, V2 is for vertical edges, V2 is even, and O is when the minimum is odd. Okay. So I'm just splitting, so if you want a picture, let's try to make a small contour, which is 1, 2, 3. And this is 2 also. Okay. I have a small contour gamma, and what I do is I'm looking at all, so these are all the edges in gamma orthogonal. Okay, these are all the edges in gamma orthogonal, and those which are in, say, let's put the origin somewhere. Let's say the origin is here. That's the origin of the lattice, just to fix what is even and odd. Let me draw gamma orthogonal H even on this picture. So this edge, if I take this pair of neighbors, the smallest first component, so it's horizontal, so I'm looking at the first component, smallest first component is even, so this guy belongs to this set. For the same reason, this guy belongs to this set. All the vertical ones don't belong. This is even, odd, even, so this guy belongs. But this is odd, so this guy does not belong, this guy does not belong. This guy does not belong. No, this guy does not belong. Okay, I think it's fine. Even, odd, so it's okay. So these are the vertices which belong to gamma orthogonal H even. Okay, it's clear what I've done. Okay. I'm just splitting into these 4 families. This will allow me to use, in a simple way, the reflection the chessboard estimate. So let's split everything. Okay, I just need 5 to 10 minutes to finish. I want to finish it now. So what we get is that the product overall UV in gamma orthogonal I plus U, I minus V, and this I can write as the product over A, which is horizontal or vertical, B, which is even or odd, of the product over UV in gamma orthogonal AB of I plus U, I minus V. Okay, I'm just splitting that. So I have a product of 4 functions. And I'm just going to use Cauchy-Schwarz twice. I just use Cauchy-Schwarz. Say first, to split horizontal and vertical, and then to split even and odd. So you use Cauchy-Schwarz twice. And what you get is that this is smaller than the product over A, which is even horizontal or vertical, B, which is even or odd, of the expected value of the product UV in gamma orthogonal AB, I plus U, I minus V, and 2 power 1/4 because you lose a power 1/2 each time you use Cauchy-Schwarz. So you use it twice, you get a 1/4. Okay. I've just split over the 4 types of edges. Now all the edges here are of the same type. And now this makes it particularly easy to apply the chessboard estimate. So of course all these terms are treated in the same way. I will just treat one. We'll consider only the term product over UV in gamma orthogonal horizontal even of I plus ui minus v. The other are done exactly the same way. Okay, I will just control this term. So now, if you look at the picture which is here, let's modify it. So that's the picture. So there is the lattice, the underlying lattice. And the torus, which is here. Okay, I'm adding things which are not here, of course. This is not part of the torus. This is part of the torus, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's our torus. It's going around in both directions. And then what I want you to observe is that each of these edges here, say, let's say the contour gamma here has pluses inside and minus outside, for example. Doesn't change anything, just to fix the IDs. So I put pluses inside the boundary, just on one side of the boundary, and minuses outside the boundary. Here, 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 and here. Okay, that's the spins. So what you see for each of these horizontal edges, which are even, so for this guy, do we have another one? This one. Okay. All these guys, they live in blocks of size 2 by 1, 2 horizontally, 1 vertically. Okay. And they are all reflections. This guy can be obtained by reflection from this one. This guy can be obtained from reflection from this one. Okay, on the blocks. They are all reflections of one of two possible functions, which are living in this particular block, which is the block containing 0 and its neighbors on the right. So I take this block, and the two possibilities here is that in this particular block here, I see plus minus, or I see minus plus. Right? I start with either a plus minus or minus plus, and then I make reflection, and I'm constructing all the possible things that I can see for horizontal even edges. Okay? So that's exactly the kind of setting where you want to apply reflection, the chessboard estimate, because in each cell, each of these 2 by 1 cells which tile your torus, you see something which is a reflection of one of two possible patterns. So that means that this product, which is where, I don't know where it is, but I will write it down. Probably I'll just erase it. So this product overall UV in gamma orthogonal horizontal even I plus u I minus v, this guy, okay. This. So what is it telling me is that for the cells which are in this set, gamma orthogonal HE, I have a plus 1 on one vertex and a minus 1 on the other vertex. Which one depends on which pair I'm looking at. Okay. So and for all the other blocks, for example, this block here, I have just one. I have no constraint here. So I'm just inserting one function. So if I use the chessboard estimate, what do I get? I get the expected value of the product over all, let me do it this way, I in the torus, I, eta I. So what is this guy? There is something to add, but let me just explain what I've been doing. So I'm choosing something which is, if I take an edge which is a reflection of this particular motif, this particular pattern, I have a plus at the origin and a minus next to the origin, right? And then when I apply the chessboard estimate, when I take this particular function, I have to look at all its reflections. So I'm constructing a configuration. I will not draw it, you have it on in the notes, but it's plus, when I make the vertical reflection, I get this. Okay? Horizontal reflection will make minus plus, minus plus, minus plus, and so on. Okay, minus plus. Continues like that. And then plus minus, plus minus, plus minus, plus minus, plus minus, plus minus, etc. Okay? If I start with this function, define this small block here, and apply the chessboard estimate, I just have to take all its reflection everywhere on the torus, and I'm constructing this configuration, which I called, I have to give it a name, eta HE, say. Okay. That's this configuration that I obtained starting from this plus minus. Okay? Deterministic configuration, and I have to do that. The other possibility is that I started with a minus plus instead of a plus minus, but it's easy to see that if you start with a minus plus and you apply the same construction, well, it's as if you started here. This is a minus plus. Then it constructs exactly the same configuration, just translated by 2 in this direction. And of course, the probability of this configuration and of its translate are the same, so I don't distinguish them. Okay? So I get this, but how many times do I get that? I get that exactly as many times as I have factors in this product. So I get this gamma orthogonal HE times, and then for each of those, I have to divide by the size of the two-dimensional torus. So that's just the chessboard estimate, right? You get a product over all these guys of factors like that. They are all equal, so this gives me this power, and I have this 1 over the size of the torus, which comes from the chessboard estimate. Okay, so that's what you get. And now the only thing that remains to be done is a simple upper bound on this expectation, and then you're done. So this, I just do it, so it's almost finished. I just have to upper bound that. So we can write this product over I, eta HE, I. Okay, this quantity which is here, I can write it as ZHE over L over Z, exactly as before. Then this guy, we already lower bounded it in the other lemma. This we already know that it's larger than exponential of what? 2 beta delta theta square minus C of delta theta over 2 beta, something like that. And the size of the torus. A bound of this type. Okay. So no problem for the lower bound here, but we have to upper bound this guy. So ZLHE, and again this is just E minus HL indicator of this thing. So product over I, what do I do? This. So when this is equal to 1, when I have pluses where I should have pluses and minuses where I should have minuses, I can lower bound the Hamiltonian. So let's assume this is 1. Let's assume the product of I equals 1. When this is true, this gives me a lower bound of the Hamiltonian, which is 1. So let's see. So we want to make it as small as possible. So it will again have minus 2 beta times the number of vertices, as we did before. But what is the energy you can get? So let's see what is this configuration. So everywhere, if you take all the vertical pairs of neighbors, everybody is happy. Everybody is staying close to somebody which has the same sign vertically. I have only pluses above pluses and minuses above minuses. So all the vertical edges, they are happy. And that means that the energy can be as low as possible. So minus 1, minus beta, right? For all vertical edges. For the horizontal edges, these two guys are happy. These two guys are happy, and so on, but these two are not happy, these two are not happy, so I have 1/2 of the horizontal guys which are unhappy, which means that overall I have 1/4 of the edges which are unhappy, and 3/4 which are happy. So I get 3/4 where I get the minimal possible contribution to the energy, and for the other one, what can I do? So I know that I have the signs of the first component have to be opposite. Right? There's something like that. This is pointing left, this is pointing right. And I want to minimize the energy. So the best thing I can do is take to align them completely in the second component. Right? Then the first component is just 0, the fact that they totally I don't care. And this gives me minus alpha. So I get alpha over 4. So that's just check it. It's an easy lower bound on H, which gives you an upper bound on Z, which tells you that this product over I, theta 1, HE, and this is smaller than exponential. Let's try to do it as before, minus 2 beta. Then we get this delta tilde squared, as before. Then you get minus 3/4 minus alpha over 4. And then you get still the C beta delta, which C delta tilde over 2 beta, something like that. On the side of the torus. Try to get to the upper bound, which of this I just putting the upper bound on this and the upper bound on that, gives you something like that. And then again, you choose delta tilde. I will just tell you what you have to choose. Don't remember. But you get the same procedure as before. You take the average between 1 and the value. So I will choose delta tilde square equal to 7 plus alpha over 8. So delta tilde square equals 7 plus alpha over 8. And if you do that, you check that this quantity, this thing becomes 1 minus alpha over 8. Yeah, check that. Say it's 1 minus alpha over 8. And which means that if I choose beta large, all these things, I can make it larger than 1 minus alpha over, say, 16. When beta is larger than beta 0. Which means, in the end, that I get something that is smaller than exponential of minus, okay, something like beta over 8, 1 minus alpha. T12, right? And then if you go back to the estimate we want, so that's the quantity we want to control, and we have this, so we have to take 2 to the power gamma divided by the size of the torus, so this removes the torus and replaces by gamma. So if I use this estimate, I get, and this is smaller than, and I finish with this, than E minus beta over 8, 1 minus alpha, and that's gamma, orthogonal H. And you do the same for vertical even, horizontal odd, vertical odd. When you sum the four bounds, when you take the product of the 4 bounds, you get the expression of the sum, and this reconstructs gamma orthogonal. So this gives you exactly what we do. So this was a non-trivial application of the chessboard estimate to a parallel type argument, which I find quite nice. And next week we'll see another application of another consequence of affection positivity, which is the infrared bound, and possibly a consequence also for next week, because it's shorter than chessboard estimate. Okay, are there questions?